Hey guys, welcome back to a new video this week. We'll be taking a look at the Warthog, one of the most classic and iconic vehicles in the Halo universe. It was inspired by the thin-skinned vehicles of the 90s, 80s, and early thousands seen in the US and our NATO allies. Bungie, being an American company, looked to the Humvee and the role it played in the civilian world to inspire the design of the Warthog. Now, at the very base level, there's a strong dichotomy between Western and Eastern or post-Soviet militaries and how we conducted maneuvering in the field. The US has predominantly relied on these light-skinned vehicles to take troops to battle where they would disembark and then fight on foot. Very light infantry, very popular doctrine in the US. Whereas Soviet and then later post-Soviet militaries a lot of times utilized heavier armored vehicles with a stronger gun, like BMDs, BMPs, and BTRs, which were armored personnel carriers. They'll get you closer to the fight and then support you once you were dropped off, which the Humvee, which is what was used in the US, was never designed for. Now you take that and you draw parallels to Halo. The Warthog, being inspired by the Humvee, saw a lot of use like that. Typically in game, we're driving around, very maneuverable, you got a gunner shooting, but at the same time in the Halo universe, it almost treats it like an armored personnel carrier. I mean, if you look back at Halo Reach, we had a full-up frontal assault with tanks and Warthogs, which the Warthog would not be very good at. And that's something, a lesson the US learned very painfully. Now, comparing the two, the Warthog is slightly longer and wider than a Humvee, but is very, very closely related, and they both kind of resemble each other. Original Humvees, mind you, didn't even have armor. A lot of times, people would take the doors off. The Warthog carries 2 and has a gunner, and the Humvee carries 4 in addition to the gunner. The Warthog as well as the Humvee both have several variants. So the Humvee, people may not know this, has anti-armor capabilities, like the tow launcher being mounted on top. It has anti-air capabilities, still in use today with the Avenger, which features IR and anti-air missiles. It's also been demoed using anti-ship and radar-guided anti-air missiles. Now, you can take that to the Warthog, which is very similar. You have the primary gun one, you have the Gauss Hog, which is, I would call, anti-armor, and then you have the Rocket Hog, which is both anti-armor and anti-aircraft. Granted, both the Warthog variants are unguided, most likely for balancing purposes. In the real world, you're not just launching rockets willy-nilly. Predominantly, they are guided. The Humvee, much like the Warthog in the game, was so inspirational, created a line of civilian vehicles. You know, in Halo 3, you see civilian Warthogs, and the real world obviously saw the H1, H2, and later H3 became very, very popular in the US. The Humvee was liked because of how low weight it was. It was maneuverable, it was great at off-road. You talk about the mountains of Afghanistan, early thousands, it was great. And it was good for what America needed at the time. However, that changed as the wars in the Middle East changed to insurgencies, particularly when we look at Iraq. The Humvee went through a sharp transition phase in the mid-thousands into the tens. And that was because after the invasion of Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan, when the Taliban transitioned to more of an insurgency, there was a much larger IED and ambush threat to US forces. Because of that, these light-skinned vehicles were incredibly deadly when countering insurgents in an alleyway, where they can mag dump an AK. You had no armor to protect you, leading to several injuries and fatalities. The US answered this by developing more armor. Humvees went through a very painful bloat phase where they were bolting as much armor as they could on them, reducing their maneuverability to the point where it was decided, hey, this is enough, we have to transition. This led to the MRAP, which was larger and heavier, but much better survivability against mines, IEDs, and light to medium rifle fire. The Warthog, however, in the UNSC universe always stayed the same. It was iconic. There was no reason to change it for the sake of the games, even though its inspiration in the real world did change. MRAPs themselves still left something to be desired, and so the LATV made by Oshkosh eventually took over and is now the primary fighting vehicle we use today. Similar to the Warthog, original Humvees just had a 50 cal with steel plates up front, but that wasn't enough, especially when we talk about snipers in an urban environment. So it led to nests, kind of like camouflage, being over the gun emplacement to mask the gunner, and then that eventually was replaced by a 360 armored belt, more or less, with windows so that gunners can keep their head down, be able to see but be protected from incoming fire. And eventually altogether, guns are being replaced now with remote controlled gun and sensor platforms on top of the vehicle, controlled from inside. That way you have no one exposed to hostile fire. The Warthog in itself keeps that classic design with the gunner in the back exposed to everything, which sucks in multiplayer because the gunners die all the time. But that doesn't mean the Warthog is impractical. Just because the real world version has transitioned and matured due to the needs of the US, I think the Warthog actually still fills a niche in today's world, not just in the game universe. And that's because Special Operations Forces have always relied on very maneuverable forces and equipment. And it's for that reason when we see the LATV growing in popularity in the US military, SOCOM, this Special Operations Command as well as Special Operations Forces in the US, needed something much lighter. Just like Spartans and ODSTs of the fictional Halo universe, they need to be able to insert quickly, do what they need to do, and get out of there. They don't need massive footprints and large vehicles slowly maneuvering through rocks. They need to be able to just zip in and zip out. And for that reason, they bought the Polaris M-Razor, which is really just a four-wheeler with a roll chassis on it. Much smaller than a Warthog, but fills a very similar role. The M-Razor has no armor. It has no doors. It is really just an ATV with a roll cage and equipment mounts. Similar to the Warthog, a lot of times it can have a jack and a winch up front. You can attach guns on the roof, or a lot of times preferred in the passenger side with no windshield, just shooting over the hood. You can carry 2, 4, and with expanded seating up to 6 people. And the reason why the Polaris M-Razor became so popular with Special Operations Forces was because of how small and lightweight it is. You can carry it in a helicopter, much like how you can carry a Warthog in a Pelican. You can fit it in the back of a CV-22 or C-130s, and you can land them and they can spread out and do reconnaissance, set up drop zones, landing zones, and infill the greater body of the US forces, which is exactly how I see Spartans and ODSTs being used in the Halo universe. They go in first, they prep the LZ, they prep the DZ. They're the ones setting all the shaping operations in order to infill the greater UNSC force. I do not think the UNSC would want to use something like a Warthog in direct frontal combat. However, Spartan teams or ODSTs in Warthogs, I think, would be a great force multiplier, being able to shape operations to allow the greater force to achieve success. We can see, looking at the environment that Bungie was in at the time, where they got inspirations for the Warthog. In my opinion, it was inspired by the Humvee, which itself was a very classic and iconic design both in the civilian and military world. But where the US learned painful lessons in the Middle East and transitioned to heavily armed, larger vehicles, the Warthog has remained the same. And I think in the Halo's universe, the way it is used in multiplayer and single player works just fine. Although I would argue that heavily armored personnel carriers would probably do the UNSC a good amount of good compared to getting shot all the time in light vehicles. When we talk about ODSTs, in particular Spartans, the players that we play in the games, using something like a Warthog exactly fills the niche you'd want to be highly maneuverable, being able to get in there, execute what you need to, and get out. If you like today's episode, you're interested in more content relating the military to video games and how the two work and how they could blend together, feel free to like and subscribe and leave me comments for what you're looking for in the future. Thanks.